Now, even though we said Martin Luther King is kind of the poster child for the modern civil rights movement, he wasn't the only person who was speaking about these issues. Um, there were other people who, at least in the beginning, vigorously disagreed with what Dr. King was doing. One of the most famous is a fellow by the name of Malcolm X, and Malcolm X and his movement from kind of a different religious perspective are going to be kind of opposed to a lot of what King was doing. Malcolm X and his eventual assassination will give rise to the Black Panther Party for self-defense, which is kind of towards the end of this modern civil rights movement. What you're going to do, or what you're going to see linked on Canvas for you, is in response to King's letter from a Birmingham jail, a speech that Malcolm X gave called "The Ballot or the Bullet," and so it's an interesting way to see the way these two different guys are looking at some of the same issues. Malcolm X is born Malcolm Little. Malcolm X was a name that he is going to assume after he converts to something called the Nation of Islam, which we'll see in just a second. But he was the son of a minister, and his dad was actually murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. There's a great film. It's got Denzel Washington in it. It's in the film library. I know you've missed hearing that. Called X or Malcolm X. Spike Lee did several years ago. It's got Denzel playing the title character. Very, very, very good film. If you can find a place to stream it, I highly recommend it. He did a very nice job. But Malcolm's dad is murdered by the Klan. His mom is emotionally a wreck after it, and Malcolm and his brothers and sisters end up being sent into foster care. In foster care, Malcolm still excels. He was the best student in his class in school, and everything's going swimmingly until one day he talks about a teacher. It's his favorite teacher, and they were talking about what they wanted to do when they grew up. And he said that he told the class he wanted to be a lawyer. And this teacher, who he looked at and admired, told him that being a lawyer was no goal for someone of his race. And it devastated Malcolm. Malcolm ends up falling into a life of crime. He um, works for uh, crime syndicate in, I think it was Baltimore, Maryland. He's running numbers for these people. Just gets really deep into a lot of this stuff. Is doing drugs, and eventually will get caught robbing houses. And so he's sent to prison. They throw the book at him because he and his accomplice are actually dating and working with white women. Again, kind of that theme of just the taboo of interracial relationships are are at play here again. Well, while he's in prison, he converts to something called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam is not quite the same as Islam the way you probably learned about it in middle school. You know that Islam is one of the largest religions in the world. It was founded by a guy named Muhammad. Has its one of its main areas in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia. Well, the Nation of Islam was an offshoot of that, but the guy who's going to run it's a guy named Elijah Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad is says he's a prophet, and he has come, but his message is much. It has a lot to do with race. It talks about a separation of the races. So it's where you had a guy like Martin Luther King who's trying to combine and end segregation. Um, there was a push in the Nation of Islam for even more segregation. Really, the thing the Nation of Islam wanted was for um, black people to be in charge of making the decisions important for their community. So they wanted the power to guide their community. They didn't want to integrate with white society. And so that sets Malcolm X kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum from Martin Luther King. They didn't get along in the early days. Um, said nasty things about each other. Just really didn't agree on the process that they thought these things ought to go. Malcolm X becomes very popular. He's a brilliant man. He's a really good speaker. I'm going to link some of his speeches for you on our playlist. But he gets in trouble when Kennedy is assassinated. Elijah Muhammad basically brings these guys in and says, "Look, we're not going to win uh, any friends by saying anything bad about President Kennedy. The country loved him." Well, somebody shoves a microphone in Malcolm X's face and says, "What does he think about it? The assassination?" He says, "Look, when you send a chicken home or chicken out in the morning, they come back home at night to roost. This man has sowed violence around the world. Why are we surprised when violence comes back?" Bad idea. He ends up getting censured by the Nation of Islam, which basically means he's not allowed to minister and that type of stuff for a period of time. About that same time, he's approached by some women who are members of the Nation of Islam who tell him that they have been um, basically impregnated by Elijah Muhammad and then abandoned. And when Malcolm X confronts Elijah Muhammad, he's devastated to learn that what they're saying is true. That this man that he has really been devoted to is a man with very human flaws. And so he ends up taking some time. He makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, what they call the Hajj, one of those five pillars of Islam. And as he's there, he figures out that Islam is not the same as what they're practicing in the Nation of Islam. That this is something that is different. He talks about praying with people who are white. That there's a lot of diversity in the in Islam. That's actually where Islam, back up just a second, is where his name came from. Malcolm X, it's not his real name. In the Nation of Islam, they taught that your last name was your slave name. Because what would happen a lot of times is slaves would be given a name, but then they would take the last name of their master. And so basically said, if you're going to throw off what these shackles of colonialism, you've got to change your name. That happens very famously in a couple of different places. One young man named Lou Alcindor, that'll become one of the greatest basketball players ever to lace him up, a guy named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. More local connection, a young man named Cassius Clay, when he converts to the Nation of Islam, will become Muhammad Ali, who our airport is named after. So Malcolm X took, it was a very long name. I'm sure you could Google it and figure out what it was. Put a very long name to signal his conversion. When he comes back from Mecca, he basically says, "Hey, I'm gonna split off, do my own thing," and he's setting up a new mosque that he's going to open, a place called the Ottoman Ballroom, and he's assassinated, just like Kennedy, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X is assassinated. 1964, so about 4 years before King's assassination. Most people believe it was members of the Nation of Islam who assassinated Malcolm X. He doesn't have quite the reach that a King does. He's not looked at in kind of that same way, but still a very important voice during this modern civil rights movement. Like I said, we're going to take the letter from a Birmingham jail speech or letter, and then his bullet of the ballot, and put those next to each other on canvas so you can get a different idea of what these guys were thinking about the modern civil rights movement. When he dies, there are a couple of guys on the West Coast that are going to start to form a political party that becomes known as the Black Panthers. Now, if you're like me, when you're young, the thing you know most about the Black Panthers is that Forrest Gump breaks up their party in one particular scene from that movie. Well, why don't you take a look at this picture, and I want to take you through a little bit with the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are formed in 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The two guys that you see there, Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale, are the guys who were there. And basically, self-defense was defense against, in a lot of instances, the police. It's founded in Oakland, California. And so these are the guys that are going to refer to police officers as pigs. Um, I definitely wouldn't suggest that if you get pulled over, right? But that was kind of the term that was being thrown around at that particular point in time. In contrast to a lot of the garishness that was coming along in the '60s with tie dye and long hair and that sort of thing, the Black Panther uniform was usually uh, a blue jean shirt, black leather jacket, the beret uh, with with kind of a neatly trimmed um, afro would have been kind of the way that they would have stood out. And very much for community. Uh, they had this 10-point plan, and I'll link it to you. Um, Huey Newton giving um, the speech where he outlines it. But basically, what they wanted is they wanted Black people to own the businesses in the communities where they lived. They wanted Black people released from jail because they said they hadn't gotten fair trials because of some of the conditions that we've seen and other things we've talked about. And they wanted Blacks exempt from military service. And they were very much on building up the community. There was one part of the Black Panthers that did a nice job of trying to build up the community. They had programs for children for breakfast. They encouraged the family units to stay together. Um, but there was also a violent arm. A lot of these guys are going to meet violent ends. Um, there are links between the Black Panthers and assassinations. And again, just much more aggressive. I think you could argue that Malcolm X is more aggressive in his tactics than Dr. King, and then the aggression steps up even to another level with the Black Panthers. At one point in time, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called these guys the greatest threat to domestic security in the United States. Into the '60s, Black Panthers kind of see the height of their popularity, and then infighting and other factors will pretty quickly flame that movement out. But again, it's one that you see quite a bit. Probably the biggest pop culture um, hangover from that is 1968 Olympics. Um, John Carlos and Tommy Smith will accept their medals for the 220 wearing black leather gloves on their hands. They hold up their fist, hand and fist in a glove as the national anthem is played in symbol of the Black Power movement. If you've seen Remember the Titans, right? That's the poster that Julius is trying to put up when he and Bertier are rooming together at the Gettysburg camp. So that is just a little bit with the Black Panther Party for Self Defense and Malcolm X.